The cold on Norvath did not kill quickly. It negotiated first. The refugee camp stretched across the frozen plain like a scattering of dim lanterns lost beneath an endless white sky. Winds screamed across the ice at nearly 70 miles per hour, carrying needles of frozen dust that rattled against shelter walls made from recycled cargo containers and emergency thermal fabric. The temperature had fallen to 30 degrees below zero before sunrise. By evening, it would be worse. Inside Shelter 12, Marcus Hale adjusted the heating regulator with gloved hands stained by machine grease and coolant residue. The old generator responded with a tired metallic groan before finally producing a stream of blessed warm air. A chorus of relieved sighs filled the cramped shelter. "Thank you, Mr. Marcus," an elderly Thessian woman whispered, wrapping another blanket around her shoulders. Marcus offered a small smile. "Do not thank me yet. If it starts making singing noises again, hit the side panel twice." A young boy nearby looked alarmed. "What kind of singing?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "If it sounds cheerful, we should all be worried." Laughter spread through the shelter. It was quiet laughter, exhausted laughter, but on Norvath, that still counted as victory. Marcus stepped back outside into the storm. Snow immediately collected on his weathered brown jacket. Beyond the shelter rows, supply drones sat motionless beside empty storage containers. The camp housed nearly 4,000 displaced civilians from 6 different worlds. Food reserves had officially run out 12 hours earlier. What remained now existed only because the human logistics officer had become extraordinarily creative with inventory reports. Marcus entered the central distribution tent carrying a datapad and a small insulated container. Dr. Celine Var, the camp physician, looked up immediately. "Please tell me you found another shipment hidden somewhere." Marcus placed the container carefully onto the table. "I found exactly one emergency Terran ration pack." Celine stared at the small silver package. "That is all." Marcus nodded. "That is all." Silence settled over the tent. Outside, the storm intensified. Celine slowly pushed the ration back toward him. "Then you eat it." Marcus shook his head immediately. "No." "Marcus." "Doctor." She folded her arms. "You have worked 36 hours without sleep." Marcus checked his datapad. 34. "That is not helping your argument." Marcus smiled faintly. "It is still not my ration." He opened the insulated container. Inside sat 6 carefully divided portions, each barely larger than a child's hand. Mrs. Talon in Shelter 8. The twins in Shelter 14. Young Ari from Medical. The old pilot with the broken leg. The pregnant Zorati woman in Shelter 3. Celine stared at him. "You divided your meal again." Marcus looked genuinely confused. It seemed inefficient not to. Before Celine could argue further, the distribution tent entrance opened. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the room. Every conversation outside stopped. Warlord Caliph Vorn entered surrounded by armored Dravik escorts. Her white war cloak carried traces of frozen snow across polished black armor. Golden eyes surveyed the camp with detached curiosity. The refugees lowered their heads immediately. Marcus simply reached for another inventory report. Caliph noticed. She always noticed defiance. Her gaze settled on the unopened Terran ration pack resting on the table. Then she smiled. Slowly, deliberately, the warlord picked it up. "Interesting," she said softly. "I was unaware humans still possessed enough status to own food." The distribution tent became so quiet that Marcus could hear ice crystals striking the outer canvas walls. Every refugee inside lowered their eyes. Nobody challenged Warlord Caliph Vorn. The Dravik Empire controlled the orbital checkpoints above Norvath. They controlled the fuel convoys, the transport schedules, and most importantly, the timing of relief access. Even in a refugee camp, power arrived wearing armor. Caliph slowly turned the silver ration pack in her hand, examining the simple blue Earth relief insignia printed across its surface. "Terran emergency nutrition package," she said. "Caloric density sufficient for 1 adult human for 48 hours. Her golden eyes shifted toward Marcus. "I am impressed. You kept this hidden." Marcus remained standing beside the supply table, his expression calm. "It was not hidden." Caliph raised an elegant eyebrow. "No." Marcus shook his head. Everyone in camp knew where it was. One of the Dravik officers laughed quietly. Caliph looked almost disappointed. And yet none of them stole it. Marcus glanced around the tent. The refugees remained silent. Hungry people usually understand hunger. Caliph studied him for several seconds. Then, without another word, she broke the ration seal. The sound seemed unnaturally loud. Dr. Celine Var inhaled sharply. Several children watching from the tent entrance stared openly. Caliph removed one of the compressed nutrient bars and took a deliberate bite. Surprisingly acceptable, she observed. Weak hands do not own food. They merely borrow it from the strong. No one moved. Marcus simply looked at the open package for a moment. Then he nodded once, as though confirming something only he understood. "Enjoy it," he said quietly. The answer visibly surprised Caliph. "You do not object?" Marcus closed his datapad. "Would it change anything?" Caliph smiled faintly. "No. Then I have work to do." He stepped past her and walked toward the tent exit. One of the armored guards shifted instinctively, but Caliph raised a hand. "Let him pass." Marcus stopped near the entrance when a small sound caught his attention. 7-year-old Ari sat wrapped in 3 blankets beside a portable heater that barely functioned. The young Zoridi girl had not spoken since arriving at camp 2 weeks earlier. Now she stared silently at the opened ration package in Caliph's hand. Marcus crouched beside her. From his coat pocket, he removed a small insulated flask. He unscrewed the lid and handed it to her. "Warm water," he said softly. "Drink slowly." Ari accepted the flask with trembling hands. Marcus adjusted the blanket around her shoulders before standing again. Caliph watched the entire exchange. "You gave away your last water reserve," she observed. Marcus looked toward the endless white storm beyond the tent entrance. "She needed it more." "And what do you need, human?" Marcus pulled on his gloves. "A replacement heating coil for Shelter 9. Without waiting for permission, applause, or sympathy, he stepped into the blizzard and disappeared into the blowing snow. Caliph remained motionless, the half-eaten ration still in her hand. Outside, the storm swallowed the human completely. Inside the opened ration package, beneath the nutritional information and emergency instructions, a tiny blue indicator light had quietly begun blinking. The storm over Norvath intensified as night settled across the frozen moon. Winds exceeding 80 miles per hour screamed between shelter rows, bending support poles and covering supply paths beneath fresh layers of snow. Inside Shelter 9, Marcus Hale knelt beside a dismantled heating unit, replacing a cracked thermal regulator with parts salvaged from 3 broken generators. The old machine finally shuddered back to life, filling the shelter with precious warmth. Cheers erupted from exhausted refugees huddled beneath blankets. Marcus simply wiped grease from his hands and moved toward the next repair request. He never stopped moving. During the next 3 hours, Marcus repaired 2 water recyclers, reinforced emergency shelter walls, updated medical inventories, and personally carried fuel cells through waist-deep snow to the camp infirmary. He ate nothing. He rested nowhere. Every few minutes he recorded names, temperatures, and supply shortages onto his battered datapad. Nobody noticed that he also transmitted a single encrypted report through the camp's emergency communications relay. The message contained only 12 words. Humanitarian protocol solace breached. Evidence verified. Full documentation attached. Meanwhile, Warlord Caliph Vorn remained inside the command shelter overlooking the refugee camp. Through reinforced observation windows, she watched the human move from shelter to shelter like a ghost beneath the storm. "He still works," one Dravik officer observed. Caliph looked mildly annoyed. Humans possess an irrational relationship with exhaustion. The officer hesitated. "Should we authorize additional food distribution?" Caliph turned sharply. "To refugees?" Conditions continued deteriorating. Caliph returned her attention to the blizzard outside. Scarcity reveals character. Weak civilizations collapse under pressure. Strong ones endure. She did not notice the blinking blue indicator still flashing inside the discarded Terran ration wrapper lying on her command desk. At precisely 2147 camp time, every communications terminal inside the Dravik command shelter activated simultaneously. Caliph frowned. No transmission request had been received. The central holographic display illuminated automatically. A simple blue symbol appeared in the air. Earth Relief Command. Every Dravik officer immediately stiffened. The symbol was recognized throughout civilized space. Earth Relief remained politically neutral, aggressively independent, and protected under more humanitarian treaties than any organization in galactic history. A calm synthetic voice filled the shelter. Attention! Humanitarian protocol solace violation confirmed. Emergency review complete. Caliph slowly stood. Display authorization. The system responded immediately. Authorization recognized. Warlord Caliph Vorn. Dravik Imperial Registry. Several officers exchanged uneasy glances. The synthetic voice continued. Evidence chain verified through registered Terran humanitarian asset number TH 1179. Caliph's golden eyes narrowed. Asset. One officer suddenly looked horrified. The ration package. The blue symbol expanded, revealing dozens of legal citations, treaty references, and interstellar humanitarian statutes. Caliph read them quickly, with growing disbelief. Every Terran emergency ration distributed under Solace Accord protection contained biometric ownership registration, environmental monitoring, and automatic chain of custody recording. Theft or confiscation from protected humanitarian personnel triggered mandatory treaty review. Caliph stared at the final line displayed across the hologram. Humanitarian neutrality compromised by governing authority. Automatic sanctions review initiated. The command shelter fell silent. Outside, Marcus continued repairing a damaged shelter roof while snow accumulated across his shoulders. He never looked toward the command center. He never celebrated. 3 hours had nearly passed, and somewhere beyond Norvath's endless storm clouds, an entire empire had just received a message it could not ignore. Warlord Caliph Vorn did not sleep that night. The storm outside the command shelter howled without mercy, but it was the silence inside that unsettled her. Dravik officers stood motionless around the holographic display as new notifications continued appearing across the air in steady succession. The first arrived from the Galactic Humanitarian Tribunal. The second came from the Neutral Trade Consortium. The third originated from the League of Independent Carriers. By midnight, there were 27 official communications awaiting acknowledgement. None contained threats. That made them worse. Caliph studied the growing list in disbelief. Explain, she ordered quietly. One of her senior officers swallowed nervously. Under Solace Accord law, interference with registered humanitarian assets automatically triggers multilateral review. Caliph folded her arms. A ration package cannot possibly affect an empire. The officer hesitated. Ordinarily, no. He enlarged one of the documents. However, Earth Relief Command classifies Mr. Hale as a Tier 1 humanitarian coordinator. Caliph frowned. A mechanic? Formerly. Another officer accessed additional records. His expression immediately changed. Warlord, you should see this. A personnel file appeared above the command table. Marcus Hale stared back from the image wearing the simple uniform of Earth Relief. Beneath the photograph stretched pages of citations, rescue commendations, and interstellar humanitarian authorizations. Evacuation Coordinator. Disaster Logistics Director. Senior Solace Architect. Caliph read silently. Then she stopped. Architect. What is Solace? She asked. No one answered immediately. Finally, the oldest officer in the room spoke. Solace is the humanitarian framework currently used across 42 civilizations. He looked uncomfortable. The food distribution standards, refugee protections, emergency access corridors, medical neutrality agreements. He paused. Much of it was designed by Marcus Hale after the Perseus famine. Caliph slowly looked toward the storm outside. Somewhere beyond the snow, the human was still working among the shelters. And I stole from him. The officer lowered his eyes. You confiscated a registered humanitarian asset from one of the framework's original authors while supervising displaced civilians. Silence settled heavily across the shelter. Then every communications terminal activated again. Simultaneously, a new message appeared. Emergency sanctions review complete. Effective immediately, all Dravik Imperial trade privileges under Solace Accord suspended pending investigation. Neutral fueling stations revoked. Humanitarian procurement contracts frozen. Independent carrier services withdrawn. Caliph stared at the words. Dravik warships relied upon neutral refueling ports. Entire frontier colonies depended on independent transport networks. Emergency medicine arrived through humanitarian exemptions. Without those systems, nothing stopped immediately. Everything simply became slower, more expensive, more fragile. Power did not collapse overnight. It quietly turned gray. One of the officers whispered, "The Empire will survive." Another answered softly, "But it will never operate the same way again." Caliph said nothing. Outside, Marcus finally returned to the distribution tent shortly after midnight. Snow covered his shoulders, and ice clung to his beard. Dr. Celine handed him a steaming cup of recycled broth. "Long night," she said. Marcus nodded gratefully. "How is Shelter 9? "Warm. Good." Celine studied him carefully. "You know what is happening, do not you?" Marcus looked through the tent entrance toward the distant command shelter where lights still burned. "Yes. You could stop it." Marcus wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "No," he said quietly. "I cannot." He looked toward the sleeping refugee camp. "The system exists so no government, including my own, can take food from hungry people without consequences." Beyond the frozen darkness, an empire had begun turning to ash. Not through fire, through accountability. Morning arrived reluctantly on Norvath. Pale sunlight filtered weakly through layers of storm clouds, casting the refugee camp in shades of silver and blue. The wind had finally weakened, but the cold remained relentless. Frost covered every shelter wall. Supply paths disappeared beneath fresh snow. Yet for the first time in days, something unexpected drifted through the camp. Hope. Shortly after sunrise, the sky above Norvath filled with descending lights. Refugees emerged cautiously from their shelters, staring upward. Dozens of transport vessels pierced the cloud layer in perfect formation. Their hulls carried no military insignia. Instead, each displayed the same symbol: Earth Relief Command. Beside it appeared the emblems of 17 independent humanitarian organizations. Children began cheering before the ships even landed. Marcus Hale stood near the central landing zone holding a thermal scanner and an inventory tablet. He looked neither surprised nor particularly impressed. Dr. Celine Var noticed immediately. "You knew they were coming," she said. Marcus nodded while checking atmospheric readings. 3 hours after a Solace violation is verified, emergency support corridors automatically activate. Celine looked toward the approaching fleet. "How many ships?" Marcus glanced upward. 42 transports. 6 medical vessels. For mobile water processors. He paused. "And probably too many administrators." Celine laughed for the first time in weeks. Across the camp, Warlord Caliph Vorn watched silently from the command platform. During the night, additional messages had arrived from Dravik High Command. Trade agreements suspended. Neutral banking access restricted. Colonial governors requesting clarification. Allied worlds reconsidering military commitments. No battles had been fought. No territory had changed hands. Yet the foundations of imperial authority had begun quietly eroding. One of Caliph's officers approached cautiously. "Warlord, several frontier governors request immediate guidance." Caliph continued watching the relief ships land among the shelters. "Tell them to protect civilian supply reserves." The officer appeared startled. "Warlord." Caliph looked toward him. "Did I speak unclearly?" "No, Warlord." He hesitated. "It is simply not standard Dravik doctrine." Caliph returned her attention to the camp. "Perhaps doctrine requires revision." Hours later, the central distribution area bustled with activity. Massive cargo containers lined the frozen plain. Portable heating towers rose between shelter rows. Medical teams moved efficiently through the camp. Nobody went hungry. Nobody remained cold. Marcus spent the afternoon assigning storage locations, calibrating water recyclers, and translating supply manifests for exhausted camp volunteers. He still had not eaten. Caliph finally found him kneeling beside a damaged heater outside Shelter 8. Snow covered his boots. Grease stained his gloves. "Your empire burns," she said quietly. Marcus looked up from the open maintenance panel. "I do not have an empire." Caliph folded her arms. "You understand my meaning." Marcus tightened a loose connector before answering. "Your empire is changing. Because of one ration package." Marcus shook his head. "No." He stood slowly. "Because someone with authority took food from hungry people and believed there would be no consequences." Caliph lowered her eyes. "I believed strength granted that right." Marcus looked across the camp where children laughed beside newly activated heaters. "Strength grants responsibility," he said softly. Nothing else. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Caliph removed the silver command insignia from her cloak and looked at it silently. For the first time in her long career, the symbol felt unexpectedly heavy. Around them, refugees lined up peacefully for fresh meals while snow drifted gently across Norvath's endless white horizon. And somewhere beneath the cold sky, an old empire had begun learning the difference between ruling through fear and leading through care. By the second evening, Norvath no longer looked like a dying camp. Warm light spilled from every shelter window. Portable fusion heaters hummed steadily across the frozen plain, painting the snow in shades of gold and amber. Fresh food distribution lines moved with calm efficiency. Children chased one another between cargo containers while medical teams completed routine examinations instead of emergency triage. The transformation felt almost unreal. Marcus Hale noticed it immediately. He also noticed that people had begun laughing again. That mattered more. He stood outside the central logistics tent updating inventory records when a priority transmission arrived from Earth Relief Command. The holographic display projected above his wrist communicator, illuminating his tired face with pale blue light. Coordinator Hale, the synthetic voice announced, Galactic Humanitarian Tribunal review has concluded. Dravik Imperial sanctions elevated to Tier 4, pending comprehensive reform. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Tier 4 sanctions were severe. Entire economic sectors would remain isolated until compliance standards were met. Behind him, soft footsteps approached across the snow. Warlord Caliph Vorn stopped several feet away. She had removed her ceremonial armor. For the first time since arriving on Norvath, she wore only a simple dark field coat. Without the armor, she looked older somehow. Less like an empire. More like a person. The sanctions have expanded, she said quietly. Marcus nodded. Yes. Caliph looked toward the refugee camp, where evening meals were being distributed. 17 colonial governors have formally declared autonomy from Dravik's central authority. Snow drifted gently around them. Several military commanders refused new deployment orders this morning. Marcus remained silent. Caliph laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. 3 days ago, I commanded systems spanning nearly 200 light years. She looked down at her gloved hands. Now my own officers question every directive. Marcus finished entering inventory data before answering. Empires built upon fear often discover they are smaller than they imagined. Caliph studied him. You speak as though humanity learned this lesson already. Marcus looked toward the distant mountains rising beyond the camp. We did. He paused. Repeatedly. Neither spoke for several moments. Nearby, young Ari sat beside a portable heater, sharing fresh bread with 2 other children. Caliph noticed her immediately. The little Zorati girl smiled for the first time since arriving at camp. She was starving when I arrived, Caliph said quietly. Yes. And you gave her your water. Marcus shrugged. She was thirsty. Caliph lowered her gaze. I do not understand humans. Marcus smiled faintly. Most humans would say the same thing. A new transmission alert interrupted them. This one originated from Dravik Imperial High Command. Caliph accepted immediately. The hologram of Supreme Chancellor Varek appeared above the snow. He looked exhausted. Warlord Vorn, the Chancellor said. The Imperial Assembly has voted unanimously. Caliph straightened instinctively. I understand. No, Varek replied softly. You do not. He hesitated. The Assembly has dissolved itself. Silence settled between them. Even Marcus stopped typing. Effective immediately, Varek continued. The Dravik Empire no longer exists. Transitional civilian governance has been established under independent sector leadership. Caliph stared at the hologram. The Empire is gone. No, Varek said gently. Only the Empire. The transmission ended. Caliph remained motionless beneath the falling snow. Around her, refugees laughed, heaters hummed, and warm light glowed through shelter windows. 3 days earlier she had taken a single ration because she believed power meant ownership. Now an empire had become ash without a single shot being fired. And standing beside her was the human who had built the system that made such change possible, not to destroy civilizations, but to remind them that no government should ever be stronger than its compassion. The news spread through Norvath before sunrise. Refugees whispered it over bowls of hot broth. Pilots repeated it while unloading medical supplies. Aid workers spoke of it quietly while repairing shelter walls. The Dravik Empire was gone. Not conquered. Not occupied. Simply transformed. The banners had come down. The old assembly chambers now belonged to civilian councils. Across 200 light years, governors, merchants, teachers, and ordinary citizens had begun building something new from the remains of what had once seemed eternal. Marcus Hale heard the rumors and continued repairing water purifiers. By mid-morning, he had already replaced 3 filtration membranes and reorganized an entire supply depot because someone had stacked medical crates beside heating fuel. That arrangement violates at least 6 safety regulations, he muttered while moving boxes himself. Dr. Celine Var found him balancing atop a cargo container. You realize most people would take a day off after accidentally reorganizing an empire. Marcus climbed down carefully. I did not reorganize anything. Celine crossed her arms. Marcus. He handed her an inventory tablet. People reorganized themselves. Nearby, Warlord Caliph Vorn stood alone beside the old command platform overlooking the camp. The platform no longer displayed Dravic insignia. During the night, camp volunteers had quietly removed the Imperial banners. No one had ordered it. No one had protested. The empty flagpoles disturbed Caliph more than she expected. For 30 years, she had served the Empire faithfully. Every victory, every sacrifice, every difficult decision had been made in service to something she believed permanent. Now only cold wind moved through vacant metal frames. Soft footsteps approached behind her. Marcus stopped beside the platform railing, carrying a toolbox and 2 replacement heating coils. Neither spoke immediately. Snow drifted gently across the camp. In the distance, children built crude sculptures from packed ice, while relief transports landed beneath pale morning sunlight. Do your people hate me? Caliph asked quietly. Marcus considered the question seriously. Some probably do. Caliph nodded. They would be justified. Marcus leaned against the railing. Hatred is usually less useful than accountability. Caliph looked toward him. And what happens now? Marcus followed her gaze toward the refugee shelters. Now, he smiled faintly. People eat breakfast. Generators get repaired. Children go back to school eventually. Caliph almost laughed. An empire collapses and humans respond with school schedules. Education is surprisingly stubborn, Marcus replied. Silence returned. Finally, Caliph removed the polished command insignia she still carried inside her coat. Without ceremony, she placed it on the empty railing. I do not know how to lead without power, she admitted softly. Marcus studied the abandoned symbol for several seconds. Then he pointed toward Shelter 8. Young Ari stood outside distributing fresh bread to newly arrived refugees, carefully ensuring everyone received equal portions before taking one for herself. Neither did she, Marcus said. 3 days ago she would not speak. Caliph watched the child quietly. And now? Now she helps because someone helped her. Marcus lifted his toolbox. Leadership starts there. He began walking back toward the shelters before stopping. Without turning around, he spoke once more. For what it is worth, Caliph, civilizations survive mistakes. Snow settled gently across the forgotten insignia as the former warlord looked toward the camp awakening beneath Norvath's endless white sky and wondered whether compassion, rather than conquest, had been the stronger force all along. The first civilian transport from the former Dravic core world arrived on Norvath 5 days later. It landed quietly at the far edge of the camp beneath a pale gray sky. No military escorts accompanied it. No banners marked its hull. The vessel carried teachers, engineers, agricultural specialists, and administrators sent by the newly established Transitional Civilian Council. Many of them looked terrified. They had spent their entire lives serving an empire that no longer existed. Now they had come seeking guidance from the very refugee camp their government had once controlled. Marcus Hale greeted them with a clipboard in one hand and a thermal mug in the other. Welcome to Norvath, he said simply. Please avoid walking between Shelter 6 and the water processors. The ice there is unstable. The delegation looked confused. One nervous administrator finally asked, Where should we report for orientation? Marcus handed him a stack of supply manifests. Storage Tent 3. Then kitchen duty. The administrator blinked. Kitchen duty? Everybody eats, Marcus replied. Everybody helps. By afternoon, former Imperial officials stood beside refugees serving soup, repairing shelter walls, and unloading medical crates. The work was awkward at first. Some refugees refused to speak to them. Others watched with open suspicion. Marcus never forced conversations. He simply assigned tasks and allowed time to do what politics often could not. Warlord Caliph Vorn watched the transformation with growing disbelief. She found Marcus later that evening repairing a damaged communications antenna atop the central logistics shelter. Snow drifted lazily through the cold air, while distant transport engines hummed across the camp. "You are integrating them," Caliph observed. Marcus tightened a connector. "I am keeping them busy." "After everything?" Marcus climbed down from the ladder. "People who build together eventually begin talking." Caliph looked across the camp. Former refugees and former Imperial personnel now worked side by side beneath strings of temporary work lights. Laughter occasionally drifted through the evening air. The sight felt impossible. "I spent 30 years teaching loyalty through obedience," Caliph said quietly. "You create loyalty through service." Marcus considered that. Humans learned long ago that shared hardship introduces people. He looked toward the camp kitchen where volunteers prepared dinner together. Shared purpose keeps them together. Before Caliph could respond, young Ari approached carrying a carefully wrapped package. The little Zorati girl stopped in front of the former warlord and held it out with both hands. Caliph looked genuinely startled. "For me?" Ari nodded shyly. Inside the package rested a small piece of fresh Terran bread and a handwritten note translated into 3 languages. "Thank you for helping unload medicine." Caliph stared silently at the gift. "I do not deserve this," she whispered. Ari tilted her head. "Mr. Marcus says helping starts again every morning." Then the child smiled and ran back toward the shelters. Caliph remained motionless long after Ari disappeared. Finally, she looked toward Marcus. "Did you tell her to do this?" Marcus shook his head. "No." He smiled faintly. "Children are frequently wiser than governments." Caliph lowered her eyes to the simple piece of bread in her hands. Days earlier she had taken food because she believed power entitled her to it. Now food had been freely offered by someone who had every reason to refuse. In that quiet moment beneath the frozen sky of Norvath, surrounded by refugees, aid workers, and the first fragile signs of a better future, Caliph Vorn finally understood what had truly turned her empire to ash. It had not been human law. It had not been sanctions. It had been the realization that an empire built without compassion had already been empty long before it ever collapsed. 2 weeks later, the storm season on Norvath finally ended. For the first time since the refugees had arrived, sunlight touched the frozen plain without interruption. The endless white horizon glittered beneath a pale blue sky, and throughout the camp, people stepped outside simply to stand beneath the light. Shelter walls had been reinforced. Permanent water processors now hummed steadily beside insulated food depots. Children attended classes inside converted cargo modules, while engineers from dozens of worlds worked together to construct long-term housing. Norvath was no longer a refugee camp. It was becoming a community. Marcus Hale stood near the central landing field reviewing departure schedules. Earth Relief Command had reassigned him to another humanitarian corridor 3 systems away. There were always more crises. Always another camp. Another storm. Another place where people needed help. He carried the same worn coat, the same battered data pad, and the same expression of quiet concentration. Some things never changed. Across the camp, Warlord Caliph Vorn watched him from beside the old command platform, now transformed into a civilian coordination center. The Imperial insignia had long since disappeared. In its place hung a simple sign written in 6 languages. Community Assembly Hall. Caliph still found it strange. She found it beautiful. As Marcus approached the landing field, he discovered nearly the entire camp waiting for him. Refugees, aid workers, engineers, physicians, and former Imperial officials stood together beneath the morning sky. Young Ari stepped forward first, carrying a carefully wrapped package. "For your trip," she said softly. Marcus accepted it with visible surprise. Inside rested fresh bread baked that morning by volunteers throughout the camp. Enough for several days. Marcus looked around. "You really did not have to do this." Dr. Celine smiled. "We know." A second figure stepped forward. Caliph Vorn. In her hands rested the unopened silver ration package she had taken weeks earlier. She had preserved it carefully. The wrapper remained unbroken except for the single missing nutrition bar. She offered it to Marcus with both hands. "I believe this belongs to you," she said quietly. Marcus looked at the ration for several seconds before gently pushing it back toward her. "No," he said softly. "Keep it." Caliph seemed confused. "Why?" Marcus glanced around the camp. Children laughed nearby while volunteers unloaded educational supplies from a newly arrived transport. Former enemies worked side by side repairing solar collectors. Warm light spilled from shelter windows. Because sometimes we need reminders, Marcus answered. Caliph lowered her eyes. She understood. The ration was no longer food. It was memory. It was consequence. It was the moment an empire discovered that compassion mattered more than power. The transport engines began warming behind Marcus. Departure time. One by one, people embraced him, thanked him, or simply shook his hand. When Calitha's turn came, neither spoke immediately. Finally, she asked the question that had haunted her since that first night. Human, why did you never hate me? Marcus adjusted the strap on his travel bag. Because hungry people do foolish things, he said gently. Civilizations do too. He smiled faintly. The important thing is what they choose afterward. Then he boarded the transport. As the ship rose into Norvath's clear morning sky, Calith stood among the people she once ruled and watched it disappear into the stars. In her hands rested a simple ration package. Around her stood a community built not by conquest, but by kindness. And for the first time in her life, the former warlord understood that the strongest civilizations were not the ones that could take food from the weak. They were the ones that made certain nobody went hungry at all.